The Cowboys are on. Can you record it?
No way! Are you serious?
But we talked like for an hour. So it's okay. I'm not hurt. She's like, I need to watch my sports.
I forgot to tell you something. So Lincoln got hit in the nose by a soccer ball.
When?
This morning. So if I get up, it's just to talk to John
You're not
and
the
come
only
back.
one. Yeah.
Okay. I really want to be here, so.
Does everybody have their phones on silent?
If you don't,
You better do it now.
Answers.
we will find you.
That might be amazing thing. I will find you.
Yeah.
Here, can you leave it off?
It's the only slide that has a fancy font. Okay. Looks like a random note.
No, that's the cutout letters.
Oh, yeah. Hey, we're admiring the fancy font on the wall.
It's very fancy. It's quite the party.
Combined.
So is there a structure? Should I
Yes, I'm going to lay it out for you right now. Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Frank Drew McAllister, and I'm the chair of Cynthia's dissertation, and her reader is Dr. Cynthia Langtu. On behalf of both myself and Dr. Langtu and Cynthia, I'd like to welcome you all to what is really a long and esteemed tradition in higher education, which goes back many, many years. And every time we do this, we are renewing a ritual, a very important ritual. It's a rite of passage, something that our society oftentimes has lost any sense of moving from one phase of your life to a new phase of your life. And part of that is not merely the mastery of knowledge, not merely the mastery of skills, but being a productive and contributing member of a science and a profession. And that's what dissertation represents. And I'm very proud to be able to say that Cynthia has done this, particularly because this is one of the last dissertation defenses for me after 34 years of teaching. And I feel it's a very apt topic because it's a topic that's dear to me, which I'll enjoy as much as I do.
It's an ongoing visualization depends on our time. So when we saw the motion happen, we must change the change. So it's an ongoing thing depending on what our society is going through. And who needs to be on the bottom, who needs to be on the top. Obviously, the people on the top are usually white. And so one of my goals is just to document everything. I feel like we're living in a time where documentation of things is kind of scary. Things are getting away. Too long because it was very hard. It's probably going to be really hard. So, education and relationship to school is a challenge to the kind of stories that we're going to talk about today. So what does it mean to be in therapy? What does it mean to be a therapist? How should it feel like? What should it look like? We're challenging that. We're getting the most marginalized, the students who are marginalized in history. And so that's already being challenged in our numbers. And as we gain more power, as we start to see the therapists or teachers or educators, we're creating our counter stories every day. So I come from a border city, and it's a metaphor I live by. And so one of the ways I tied all the stories together was I used the metaphor of the borderlands to talk about these divides that we experience as student therapists and as educators in the healthcare field. So I regard the borderlands as any place where there's two worlds colliding. How many people, by the way, have been to a border city, a border town? Okay, 4 people, 5 people. So if you've been to one, you know that there's like language classes, but then there's also a beautiful merging of languages. There's this cool like identity development when people are taking from different things and they feel right. Mexican American is supposed to be the embodiment of a border. So that's why we're not really nation proud. We're just showing that we have taken into society and we embody them. So Gloria was a really big poet when it comes to talking about the borderlands. She actually came from the same area in South Texas as I do, so she's pretty much my idol. She refers to the borderland as an underworld, as a place to utilize la facultad, which is basically walking with fear and perseverance. and being able to, I guess she calls it, the capacity to see in-surface phenomena and the meaning of deeper reality. So not looking at just black or white, being able to see the undertone of things and walk in that world. It's a very limitless, boundaryless world. And what I have found, very specific to Western culture, is we like our boundaries. We like our lines, and we like our roles defined for us. So the goal of this is to not do that, to break those boundaries. So I use this little line between things, between words during my presentation to show that there is a wall that's created. And a lot of students, especially therapists, feel that line a lot. I have to be a professional. I can't walk in with my own history. And so that can be really hard, especially if you identify with the population that you're working with. So I use the term gray borderland. She talks about it as an underworld. But I use the term gray to illustrate this dismantling of black and white. And I hope if you picture it, picture yourself walking in this gray land of two different worlds to yourself, your personal world and your professional world. If your therapist, your healer, and your wounded self. If your teacher is yourself as a student and yourself as a teacher. And we're constantly thinking that they're different, and the whole point of this is to show that it's the same. And if we're able to sit with that ambiguity and that scary feeling of not having lines, maybe we can do some great things. So oppressive, I really like Cud's definition of it. Oppression names a social injustice, which is to say that it is perpetuated through social institutions, practices, and norms, on social groups, by social groups. There's an act of othering, so people who are not privileged in an oppressive system are othered. There's a lot of other ways of putting it, so marginalized, underrepresented, underserved. Students of color was one of the first terms I used, but as someone who is obviously not of color, I feel personal conflict with that term. So I finally settled on marginalized students, and I had some great feedback how I'm still learning to use person-centered language, and that's kind of hard for me. And if I think about it a little bit, I think it's because I don't receive person-centered language. So it's kind of in my vocabulary still. So I'm going to be trying to say students who are marginalized, but I purposely didn't change it to show you all that I'm still learning too. And just for some pictures, there's Donald Trump signing our anti-abortion bill. And there's a group of men watching him sign the bill, telling women that what they can do with their bodies. This is one way that abortion is continuing to happen. If you're talking about school, one of the reasons close to my heart is in a lot of anti-oppressive clinical practice and anti-oppressive practice in general, whether it's in your therapy room, in your classroom, in your meetings, it works to resist any sort of institutionalized oppression. It can be very easy to not see it and to just be mindlessly going through it. So it's very intentional, and we're starting to get better at naming it and setting guidelines for it. So the multicultural and social justice counseling competencies were a big stride to bring in the social justice side of the multicultural social justice border. So we're going to talk more about that later and what that looks like with the stories that we go through. And just FYI, if you all aren't from the therapy field, all students, no matter where they are in their program or what kind of program, we all do what's called a practicum or a clinical training year. And that's before we work without supervision. And so this clinical training year is like an outside of the classroom experience where we actually practice what we're doing, what we're learning in the classroom. And it's a second education. It's more experiential and it's more hands-on. I feel like I became the therapist I am because of practicum. You know, school is a different side to me. So anti-oppressive pedagogy, Freire kind of paved the way for it. All of his work is in Portuguese, so I think his quotes are just amazing. So he talks about how education there's an option. We can use education to indoctrinate people and to continue using this kind of oppressive system to keep certain people uneducated or poorly educated, or we can use it as a place where we can resist and we can fight for a better world. And through doing that, we can model it. What does it look like when we have anti-oppressive classrooms and teachers and learning styles that are accommodated for? So I also just feel that a lot for marginalized students, we've experienced oppression in school. And that's one of the biggest things I want to say today. One of the, the white narrative is school is a great place where we learn and we grow and we feel great. But for a lot of marginalized students, it's a place where we feel small and silenced and wrong or in trouble. So I wanted to link this. It's a 2-minute video. And I think it's just a great way to capture all of this before we move on to what I did. But of course, it's going to be on. Hold up real quick.
Don't we need more people of color in films and movies? Isn't this wonderful? What is the trajectory? Where is the arrow pointing? The arrow is pointing away from white power. In my lifetime, what's going to probably happen is that I'm going to become a minority in the United States. But what do I want for my great-grandchildren? I do want them to live in a white society, a European empire. You don't consider yourself a racist? I would never say something like, I don't like black people. I mean, that's not what I'm about. You don't want to be in your neighborhood. Right. I mean, I think the country is fragmenting because at the end of the day, racial differences cannot fundamentally be breached ever. What?
So that's Spencer. He campaigned for our president. He's associated with Bauman, our counselor for our president. And I just think he does a great job in 2 minutes to just directly say what we're fighting against. He also talks about representation of white people in power. And I think that's a great way to show how it could be not apparent. We could have a really diverse school or a really diverse healthcare setting, and then we look at the people in power and see who's actually in charge. He also has a way of talking that, he looks like a nice guy. He's smiling. He's using nice language. He's not someone that's like uneducated, and it's not so apparent until you start listening to him. And that's one of the subtle ways that I think racism has started to evolve in our country. And so I just think it's really important to hear that and remember that, as much progress as we made, there's a there's a huge force of people who are working to set that back in our government, in our politics, people in power who are setting it back. So this is going to be our outline. I'm going to go through a few more things in my lit review of just what I focused on, and then I'm going to go straight into my methods and my studies. So I just talk about segregation having happened in our country, and to this day, we still see great academic achievement gaps, whether it be in elementary or in grad school. We see students of color who are more likely to drop out, and when that happens, when we drop out, it's a matter of health. It's not a matter of going to another school because you were in a private school. It's a matter of having to support your family or living in a dangerous neighborhood. And so the issue is critical psychology has really brought in this health disparities aspect to what the academic achievement gap means. And what we find is that for every year that someone is not in school, at least in higher education, it's associated with an extra 7 years of life. So whenever we see students drop out, it's a hit because it's also, they're less likely to engage in like promoting health behaviors, going to the doctor, making decisions that will keep them safe and healthy for them and their children and their families. So this is also, that's why I focused on it as a health professional, because as much as it's in the world of education, it has immediate effects on who our clients are. Chicago, I wanted to mention, so one of the first, when all of our schools were shutting down, the schools that were shutting down were the schools in the poorest parts of our city. And that's strategic. That's not a coincidence. So the students, they already had like a 50% dropout rate in these high schools, and then they completely shut down the high school. So we're seeing this happen in our own city, I think, also because of the segregation that happens in our neighborhoods. So public health has really focused on health equity and focusing on all the different ways that health is impacted by social determinants. Our field is really starting to acknowledge the impact of race and ethnicity and trying really hard to put in all aspects of our study. So whether it be in the classroom, in our practice, or in our research, really focusing on what we can do to reduce these health disparities. Here's the model for counselors to start thinking about their privilege and the way their privilege can impact their therapy. So one of the other contributors of health disparities, at least in mental health, is that patients will, or clients will, experience racism with their therapist or with the clinic that they walk into. So in addition to whatever setbacks they were experiencing, then they go to the doctor and they experience it there too. So there's a bunch of, it's just pretty neat that the fields, all fields, medical, psychology, are starting to move to a focus on social determinants of health throughout the world, actually. This is Scotland. So the purpose of my study, I really wanted to contribute to the field in this way since there is a call for it. And I have a side focus of critical race theory, so just documenting the counter stories. And it's the process of this research that I think was another purpose. So the way I conducted my study, was it in an anti-oppressive research stance? How was I treating my clients? How was I treating the data? And really trying to set a model for how research can look like. Research has its own history of being oppressive. And so I got my degree in research before I came here, so I really wanted to start that. I really wanted to set an example for what kind of method and what it looks like in practice. So here I'm going to just use this slide to go through it. So educational experiences of marginalized students. We see that students who go to school in higher education, they're more likely to succeed, especially if there's some kind of opportunity to learn about their own history. We see that especially with Mexican Americans, since there's been such a fight for that in Texas, and those programs are right now, unlike historically black colleges, who are going through a lot too, actually, with this presidency. There's a lot of programs in Arizona right now that are getting stripped away from Mexican Americans. And it's sad because we see that students who go to these programs are not only more likely to graduate and have social mobility, but they're more likely to stay alive longer. So one of the best ways that we can improve educational experiences of marginalized students is just to have more diversity, make sure to have that in the population of students and faculty. When our faculty is diverse, we're more likely to see faculty who are conducting research like this. And that helps the students feel included and welcome and have a positive role model for their field. Another way to improve educational experiences is to engage in anti-oppressive pedagogy. So I have a great graphic for that. So right here is the banking model. It's one example of an oppressive education practice when students are treated as depositories. And we're not meant to question our teachers, we're not meant to dialogue with our teachers. The difference between dialogue and conversation is dialogue is usually power balanced, and we're looking to solve a problem together. There's also a sense of accountability with dialogue. It's a space where we can call each other in, and we can ask them, you know, well, what do you actually mean by that? And it's this place where a lot of learning happens, as uncomfortable as it is. So really changing this model, right, of what it may look like right now.
20 minutes.
So learning styles is another one, listening to how students change, or how students learn and accommodating to all the different ways. So experiential learning is a big one. And this is one example of brave spaces, another way of doing dialogue. So when I was talking to my participants, that's what it looked like. We were talking about things that were difficult, we were talking about oppression and personal experiences of it, and I kind of held power as the researcher. So I really focused on giving permission to talk about these issues and really focusing on what kind of emotion came up while they were talking about it and allowing it. Because what we find is when we walk into these spaces, emotion is usually taboo. And sadly, I feel like when we learn the most is when we're crying or when we're angry. So in my dissertation, or in my study, I really tried to just model this anti-oppressive practice. So I'm going to show you, this is one of the biggest things I want you to know before we talk about the story. This is an example of Black racial identity development, but it could also be extended to people of color in general. We start off with a pre-encounter stage where we're blind to oppression. We may see things like, I don't see color. And then an encounter is something that happens that might wake us up. An encounter can take a while, but what's neat about it is that it's the beginning of us starting to question everything. Immersion is when we start to learn more about ourselves and embrace our own diversity. Internalization is when we have really started to secure that identity and start forming coalitions to resist. And internalization commitment is really important for this study because it's the way we do that in our profession. It's a plan of action. So some kind of personal ties are articulated through our professional responsibility. So how do you take up all of your social justice missions in the role that you're in? Because it's possible. So I'm going to skip on over to, so crossing from multiculturalism to social justice is one of the things that our field is struggling with right now. Rather than staying in our safe, inclusive spaces, we need to be brave and we need to fight. And we need to open more spaces in our settings, in our, like, everything from the street to the classroom to our therapy office. And just learning how to do that is one of the biggest obstacles because we don't even talk about it sometimes. So I didn't have a social justice class throughout my 5 years here. I had a multicultural class and I had a diversity class, but a lot of schools experience this. We're really safe. You know, we stay in the cultural learning part of the world and we don't cross over to action. So, if this dissertation is my action, I'm gonna talk about what I did. So Rosano and Yoso, I really want to credit them. They started with the method of creating counter stories. It's a matter of getting literature, so like how I'm quoting Ansagua throughout all of this. It's using our own experiences, especially if our experiences are marginalized ones. And it's really valuing the family wisdom and the collective wisdom that we carry. As people of color, we've traditionally been told that that's not scientific and empirical. And so starting to change that way of looking at data and analyzing it. So here's my little flyer. for those of you who saw it. I gave everyone $15 for participating. And these are the 5 questions I asked everyone. Can you tell me a story about how oppression has come up in your education or training? 5 of my participants straight up said no. They were not asked about it at all. A few of my participants didn't know what oppression meant. One of them asked me, can you define it? Another one gave me like an incorrect definition of it. And another one said that her school focused more on multiculturalism. That was actually 2 participants. And a lot of people answered this question with a personal experience of oppression. And all of these personal experiences of oppression happen in a school setting or in a healthcare setting. As you notice, I never directly asked, can you tell me about a personal experience of oppression? I tried really hard to not assume it, and if they didn't have anything, I said, okay, that's data 2. All 11 of my participants told a personal experience of racism or sexism as a student therapist. I had one participant that had graduated already, and she used that time to talk about what it was like as a student and how she uses her power now. But I just thought that was really breathtaking, the fact that I didn't even ask about it and everyone had, and they brought it up on their own, you know. I was asking about, so number 2 wasn't asking them to tell the story, it was asking them to talk about their teachers, bringing up these conversations. And these stories were really beautiful. They talked about beautiful relationships, intimate, close relationships with teachers, peers, who were able to have this kind of dialogue, this kind of talk within their classes. Or with supervisors was another one. Very personal stories in professional spaces. And then can you tell me a time about when you felt empowered or liberated by your school or educators? This is getting at anti-oppressive pedagogy. And the healing and liberation that is required for marginalized students, especially students who have experienced oppression in school by educators. So of my whole sample, my Mexican-American, I had 4 women who were Mexican-American. And all of their stories about empowerment were collective-based, so they were really glad to see professors who looked like them or had access. But they weren't telling me stories about their own empowerment, of things that they stood up for. It was more being inspired about other people. And I don't say that judgmentally because I think that's our culture. But everyone else had a really great story about ways that they stood up for themselves and what led up to that, what led up to them getting that voice, and how their educators or their supervisors played a role in them being able to be empowered and to stand up for themselves. 3 of the participants had, I believe, really powerful anti-oppressive education experiences where they got to move through their racial identity development within their classroom setting, with peers witnessing it or their educators witnessing it. And so that's kind of the stories that came from number 3. And then can you tell me a story? 4 and 5 are getting at practice and the implications of personal growth with professional confidence. So can you tell me a story about how your own oppression and empowerment in your education has affected your practice? For the people that didn't seem to experience anti-oppressive pedagogy, they kind of talked more about just being able to acknowledge their biases, but not talking about using multicultural social justice approaches. So actually, everyone who seems to have some kind of anti-oppressive education experience was able to talk about very specific interventions that they engaged in with their clients as student therapists. And I just thought that was really neat. So they talked about power balancing, not using their power to benefit them within the therapy room, empowering their clients to challenge them, empowering their clients to talk about things that may be disruptive in their clients' community. And so we're going to go into what kind of specific approaches later, but that was pretty neat. So can you, and the last one really gets at my own personal curiosity. Can you tell me a story about what it is like to be whatever self-identified background they were, and what it's like working with a population of another marginalized background? So I was really interested in what it's like when we work with people who look like us and who share our histories, because there's a lot of what's called transference, I think is one way of seeing it. I see it as healing with our clients, especially because we come from shared histories of oppression. And I was just really curious how student therapists thought about that or experienced that if they didn't have the education for it. Our programs have not traditionally been serving people who are going through an experience like this. So how do students experience it? What do they make out of it? And do they think it's a positive thing? Do they think it's a negative thing?
10 minutes.
So here's just the analysis I did. Pretty boring stuff on this over there. This is what my data would look like. So I organized themes. So I read through all the stories, and I saw what kind of themes came up across all of them, or what themes may have been unique to certain people. I was really interested in what was unique to people who seemed to have anti-oppressive education experiences, and what may have been unique to people who didn't. So this is a really hard lighting to see everybody. I had 11 students. 10 of them were women of color. One was a Filipino man. And I think I have a good graphic here. So three of my participants were African American or identified as Black. 4 of them were Mexican American, Latino. 3 were Asian American. Of the Asian Americans, 2 were immigrants, and 1 biracial woman. So of the immigrants, I never asked about immigration history, but it came up because of these experiences that they were talking about. I had a pretty diverse sample when it comes to immigration history. So 3 of them were first generation, which means they migrated here. And 1 of them was the child of immigrants. And I guess a good amount of them were grandchildren of immigrants, so 3 of them. And the only people who were not immigrants were African Americans. And this is just my representation. I had a pretty good sample of PsyDs, so doctoral level and master's level students. And I talk about what it's like to be in the city and what it's like to be in the border. So training in Chicago, we're working with a diverse, impoverished community, just so you can picture what the participants were working with and where were they growing from. And I just want to say this one story so that we can have a good idea of the border city that I come from, or just the area I come from, and I think it could really help us all think about the perspective of the clients or the participants that came from here. So I'm going to read this to you. In the field, La Migra, Border Patrol, my aunt's saying, no corren, don't run. They'll think you're del otro lado, the other side. In the confusion, Pedro ran, terrified of being caught. He couldn't speak English. Couldn't tell them he was 5th generation American. Sin papeles, he did not carry his birth certificate to work on the field. La amiga took him away while we watched. Se lo llevaron. He tried to smile when he looked back at us, to raise his fist, but I felt ashamed pushing his head back down. I saw the terrible weight of shame punch his shoulders. They deported him to Guadalajara by plane. The furthest he'd ever been to Mexico was Reynosa, a small border town opposite Hidalgo, Texas, not far from McAllen. Pedro walked all the way to the valley, about 600 miles. Se lo llevaron sin un centavo al pobre si vino andando desde Guadalajara. They sent him without a cent to his name, and he came walking from Guadalajara. So I love this story because it shows just how much language plays a big role in the way we think and the way we experience the world. And I think it's just this is a counter story. Not all Americans speak English. Not all Americans are just the way people see Mexican Americans, I think, is really challenged here too. And so I had a good sample of people who identified this way or came from this area, so had family like this, and served people who came from this background. So Fati, Mona, and Sabina were from an area like this. And they went to majority Mexican-American schools. But none of their schools had social justice missions. And everyone else worked in Chicago. Yonsei, Jael, Felicia, Annie, Larry, and Belle worked with diverse clientele. Yonsei actually now works with diverse clientele, but Yonsei actively sought white populations, non-black. She didn't want to work with people who looked like her. She was scared, too. So I'm going to go to my findings. We can talk about the big graphic. These are all this is kind of like the counter stories. So I made a story for each participant. So one of the first things I saw was the way that people tell their stories really depended on their development. Where were they in their racial identity development? And it was really important because when something happens to us, the way we're thinking is the way we make meaning out of it and what we do. So if we're not empowered, and someone's doing something to us, the way that story is going to end is probably really different than someone who is empowered and has the confidence and ability and the energy and the desire to say something. And so one of the first things I saw was just people who seemed to be, I wasn't giving them some kind of formal racial identity assessment, but it seemed that people who were higher up in their racial identity were telling stories that ended differently. Like they were doing things. They were challenging their educators, and they were challenging their supervisors or themselves. And their stories were ending in a way that they were at least trying to do something about the problem that they were witnessing or experiencing. And then there was this role of development where if they weren't in this place, it seemed like they maybe didn't even see the problem, or they not only didn't do anything about it, but the story would end kind of like Sabina, for example, talked about this guy who was really macho, and he was telling her that she didn't have it in her to like succeed in the place, and she just kind of rubbed it off. And she was like, okay, I'm just going to deal with this. And she never told him anything. Belle talked about racist treatment that she saw in her setting, and she ended up doing a full presentation for her supervisors, teaching them what racist treatment looks like. So the difference, right, in the stories and what it took, like the process it took inside to be able to get there, was one of the first things I wanted to account for. And then there were stories that happened across everybody. So like personal experiences of oppression was one of the across-the-board themes that came up. And then there were unique circumstances that people didn't experience just because they weren't in that situation. So let me go to my graphic. These are all the stories. So here we go. So I organized it by the racial identity development model. So here's the beginning, pre-encounter, up to internalization. I put this on the personal side of the border because these are usually experiences that are personal. And then I put the professional side of the border. I focused on competency, well, lack of education on oppression was at the bottom, just to indicate we're not going to be able to have competency if we don't have education about it. And then as we develop the skills for that like multicultural and social justice guidelines, then we started to have very clear social justice missions that we're enacting within the professional setting. So we need two forms of development in order for this to work. We can't just be developing here. And I think that the danger happens when our school just focuses on here. Because we can't get here without having all of these experiences. And so let's just go through them real quick. So one of the first things I saw was conformity, not acknowledging oppression. I had someone actually tell me, so Fati had a Mexican-American supervisor, and I asked her, what was it like for you, you know, having a boss, and like your first boss was Mexican-American, a woman too, like, and she said, I don't see color. I just saw a person. And that might work, actually, like in a majority place where it doesn't matter and you're living the majority experience. But then I have people on the immersion stage who were like really immersing in their culture, And they wanted like a black supervisor, they wanted a Latino supervisor, and they wanted that role model to show them what that looks like when they've succeeded, you know? And so it just really shows the difference. Encounter, so that's that big moment when you start opening your eyes to oppression. I regarded that as having it in school. So Felicia talked about the first time she did a privilege walk. And at the end of her story, she says, it was that moment that I was able to say, I'm an oppressed person. It was a really big moment for her. She was able to see, like, after that classroom exercise, which is like one of the first days of school, she started to continue to develop and learn more about the history of her culture. People who were in the encounter status were also people who, I think, like, since it takes a while, I got to see a range of what it looks like to start naming the oppression personally and then start naming it professionally, like for clients. If we can't name it in either world, it's going to be hard to do it in general. So some people were able to say, hey, yeah, I went to a poor school, or I didn't have like the experiences that other people had, but they weren't able to say, I experienced racist treatment. So someone like Belle was able to say racist, or someone like Felicia was able to say, this is how my supervisor was treating me. He was stripping me of my power through this relationship. Saying it very clearly, very assertively, and starting to see like how different, you know, the people who were kind of seemed to be lower in the development were using a lot of qualifiers. Well, maybe it was oppressive, or it was kind of oppressive, or I don't know, what do you think? You know, and so I could tell that they were still thinking about it. So as they started going up and they were exploring their own identities, they were talking about, JL talks about her physical features and how she started to love herself for who she was. Felicia had this funny quote about, I'm done with white boys. So the emergent status, so the E part is about like kind of avoiding whiteness for a little while because you can't trust it. You can't trust white people to tell your own history. You can't trust white people to see your body and love it for what it is. So Felicia and Belle actually talked a lot about their emergent status. And Belle talked about wanting more women of color in power in her school and just wanting more professors that look like her or look like someone other than a white man. So seeking that race representation, like we talked about. And then a big one was attention to wholeness, permission for wholeness. One of my favorite quotes was from Jessica. And Jessica said, it's not until the white students open up that I'm going to feel comfortable to share my story. And it just always gets to me whenever I hear her say that, because it's just so crazy how peers have that much power. And she talks about what happens is that conversation, she got to experience peers rejecting a professor trying to bring this up and using their power and privilege to get that professor fired. And it was one of the first times that as an Asian American woman, she didn't feel invisible, and she felt like she was actually being acknowledged, and then she witnessed her white peers rejecting it. So this attention to wholeness, being able to experience emotion, being able to talk about these experiences, it's a matter of sacrificing parts of ourselves or ignoring them for the comfort of our white counterparts. The internalization is when we start to form coalitions, and if you went through immersion, you're more likely to start forming coalitions with white people, and you're not so color-based anymore. So JL had a great quote about how she was seeking a black supervisor, and she just wanted black, 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 she said. And then she experienced that relationship with her, and that person was actually not developing their own racial identity. And so what was more important was not finding someone who was black, but was finding someone who was also focused on racial identity development. And I just thought that was really cool because it's one of the things that happens from immersion. We're thinking just in faces of color. You know, we want someone who looks like us, who has the same culture. But what's more important is, and she goes on to say, it could have been anyone. It could have been a white man. It could have been an Asian woman. It just had to be someone who was willing to have this dialogue with me and who was willing to bring it, to let me be whole. Felicia talked about a supervisor that she was able to cry with and how important that was because she sacrificed her wholeness, during other meetings that she had to go to with other professors, and how healing it was for her to be able to cry with a professor or supervisor in that case. So openness to those kind of relationships was really important, being able to have these conversations that were walking the line between personal and professional. So then on the professional side, there was a bunch of resistance, so not even wanting to talk about oppression. I think it was Sabina. So during this time, there was a bunch of anti-immigration rhetoric, and they're working at a refuge center where all the miners are coming from Central America. And I asked her, well, how is that going? And she was like, oh, we don't talk about it. We don't talk about it with our clients. We don't talk about it with each other. We just don't talk about it. And so that's an example of resistance. Whereas problematization at the very top, JL went on to talk about how we need educators who are awake to social injustice. And she's starting to critique the system and the faculty that she's having to look up to. So rather than resisting it and not even want to acknowledge it, we're confronting it and we're trying to solve problems that we're seeing, even though we're students and we don't have power in the system. Belle was problematizing with her site, her clinical training site, and trying to figure out ways that she could educate her supervisors. So competency development was one of the ways I can just show how people who went through racial identity development had professional benefits. So Larry, my one guy, he perfectly defined cultural humility, which was one of the stances that are anti-oppressive. And he talks about how psychologists are privileged in our education and in our power, and we have to learn how to be more humble in this field and stop we have to depathologize, he said. Certain cultures and certain populations are just automatically pathologized. And so he was talking about the ways he does that in the therapy room. Jessica, Felicia, Larry, Belle, all of them had examples of cultural humility. And I just thought that was pretty amazing as students, you know, we didn't have a cultural humility class, you know, that's usually not in our curriculum. And somehow these students were able to go through their racial identity development, experience personally why it's so important to have that stance, and start doing it with the power, the little power that they did have as students. And then the last part was where I documented all the personal social justice missions. The most concise one I thought was by Jael, and she said, I want to serve my people. And that was basically something that was eventually said by Yonsei, who was avoiding white clients, or was avoiding black clients. And now as a graduate, she said, I want to be part of an African-American community. I want to be part of a highly educated female African-American community, and I want to serve my people in whatever role that may be. And it's just pretty neat that we're able to make those, articulate those social justice missions. I think that's the very end of development, when we have a very clear goal and we can learn how to get there and learn how to take advantage of the systems we're in. Here's the across the board thing. Family support came up across everyone. And family values and education were really big for the Mexican American sample. Unwavering family support, especially if the person was going through some kind of problem with the school. I had three participants who went through some kind of disciplinary action during their higher education, and that's when they talked a lot about family. So family wisdom in dealing with oppression. Larry talked about how as a minority, his dad taught him that he's always going to have to work harder. He talked about how he got that taught when he was just a kid. Belle talked about how her dad showed her how to ask questions in a diplomatic way to not threaten whiteness. Learning how to pass down this wisdom, no matter how much education you get. The school bubble, I use the term bubble because that's what Jael used, but several people ended up using the term bubble. And it was just really neat that that term kept coming up. And I organized themes of a liberative education experience, so that's like the ideal one. So when people felt like they were healing in school and they were getting stronger and more empowered and better able to leave the bubble, to just something as small as getting praise from our professors and feeling like we can do it and we're in a place that is accepting and inclusive and not trying to push us out of school. And then Jessica talks about affirmations. So having a social justice mission or having some kind of multicultural value in her school helped her feel like she was in a bubble, and a safe bubble, a secure bubble. Survival skills came up. The word survival came up a lot. Words that were associated with survival came up. So escaping, refugee, feeling like a refugee, having to sacrifice came up a lot. And I pretty much like to look at what survival could look at the bare minimum. So Fatih was talking about what it's like as an immigrant. And then several of the people who seem to be higher up were talking about what survival looks like in the professional world. So talking about sucking it up. Yonsei experienced racism at her clinical site. And she talked about like, okay, I'm going to play the game. I'm going to make sure I tell everyone hi, and I'm going to nod, and I'm going to smile. So I put those stories in survival, or resilient coping. I haven't talked about Valerie. Valerie was Mexican-American, and she talked about how she took the educated American dream and she used it in a way that reminded people that she belonged in school. And if people made her think that she wasn't going to belong in school, she was going to use that and show them that they were wrong. And she used that resilient coping style all throughout her education, no matter who was telling her that she didn't belong in that program or whatever. So using that kind of resiliency to keep that academic success going. And then these are the last three themes. Disciplinary action came up, and I organized a bubble pop feeling, since that the bubble theme was there. So what happens when we feel safe and secure in our school, and then all of a sudden our school is doing something to us? Our bubble pops. And Jessica talks about how all of a sudden it's like, oh, I got a glimpse of the outside world. It's no different, just with a mask of academia. And feeling betrayal came up a lot. That word, betrayal, came up among a lot of the students who either experienced disciplinary action or realized that the mission of their school was just to be posted in their school and it wasn't going to be enacted. And then this is a big one. So the one I was really interested in, what's it like to work with other marginalized clients? I think I'm going to end on that one. I'm just going to say this one about the white clients. Valerie and Yonsei were the only two that talked about this. And they talked about being really preoccupied with race-related judgments. So the first time they saw a client, Yonsei would find, as like an independent practitioner now, she was like, do they know I'm black? And that was basically like her first thought every time she met a client. Did they look me up? Did they Google me? Do they know I'm black? Are they surprised right now? Power dynamics were another big one. Belle talked about how she evens the playing field with her black teenage clients. And then with her white clients, she finds herself being more assertive and just being very conscious of how she navigates herself in the therapeutic relationship. And very, like, the word we use often is intrusive. So Yonsei and Valerie talked about how they couldn't let those preoccupations go. They would be in group or whatever, and Valerie has an accent, and she was talking about, like, she could see when people realized who she was, and just worrying about that during session. So that really points to the type of skills we need, doesn't it? And what kind of things that we can help our students just work through, and how can we get rid of those preoccupations? How can we even talk about them with our clients? How can our professors better prepare us to deal with these unique issues that come up if we are marginalized and we're working with a white population? And then similarly, what kind of skills do we need when we work with people who come from our background and who also share these experiences of oppression? Or maybe they know nothing about oppression. How do we teach them about it if we feel like that is inherent to healing and liberation? Where can we get that education? Where can we get that training? And so there were 5 big things that I felt that really point to where our field should be headed and what the main lessons are of this study. The students who were telling these stories were like, we need to, like, every time it happened, all the students looked at me and were like, Cynthia, you need to say this. We need this. And at least the students who were in the part where they were committing already, they wanted it to be documented. This is what our educators need to know. So one of them was a perception of threat to confidence and identity. Yonsei talked about feeling like she was going to have to defend herself if she worked with people who look like her. Jael talked about feeling guilty that she was healing with her clients, and she felt like she was putting her needs first, and her supervisor didn't help with that feeling. So avoiding them. Felicia talked about feeling like she was in the same world of her clients and just avoiding her black clients because she felt like she was going to be incompetent if she started to show her personal side. So feeling like you have to walk along this border and don't cross into the personal side. So that perception of incompetence, because it's fairly impossible. Jael put it really well. I can't separate Jael with therapy Jael. That's impossible. So what kind of skills do we need to deal with that threat? That may be very justifiable. Mutual understanding and comfort. Felicia had this cool quote where she said, there was like this metaphysical connection. I could talk to him like he was my uncle. She talks about feeling like her clients were looking at her and like communicating everything that could not be said out loud in their majority white institution. Feeling like safe with her clients, especially in an institution that didn't feel safe. Telling them what I wanted to hear was a quote that came up across a lot of the participants. And some people were really proud of that. Fatih was really great at articulating a beautiful, educated American dream and instilling that in her clients. I'm a product of my mother's the same way. And I just think it's really cool when people are those dream holders and they make it their mission, like among kids, to say, you can do this. And if someone, Fatih talks about it, like if someone doesn't have anything nice to say, just say, okay, thanks, bye. And teaching her clients how to do that. She had 7-year-olds who had crossed over here. And that was one of her big missions, telling something that I needed to hear and that I maybe didn't hear. And I talked about this spiritual, familiar, empowering. Larry talked about how his own clients empowered him. And I think that kind of is a great way to like sum all this up. If there's anything I learned about all of these stories, is that the counter story of the therapeutic relationship and even the relationship we have with our educators, at least for marginalized students or marginalized student therapists, they could be very empowering and healing relationships when we let them. And that crosses so many borders, you know? It really teaches you, like, what is a teacher and what is a healer and what is a student and what are we actually doing here, you know? And what kind of coalition can we build together and who's actually healing right now? And I think that's just a beautiful counter story that we need to bring to our schools and to our healing spaces. Because a lot of times we define who's healing and we define who's knowledgeable and who's educated. But really, at the end of the day, that's just not what it looks like. And that's not what it feels like for a lot of people, especially people who are marginalized. So I know I talked really fast, but I think I covered everything. Just want to go through the limitations really quick. Let me get through them. So limitations are just things I wasn't able to do in the study or things that came up that I wasn't able to attend to at the very end. So something that could have definitely affected storytelling was if participants did not have practice talking about oppression. Participants who did have practice were better able to use terms, better able to conceptualize the problem and articulate it to me and tell the story in a way that was really easy to see, like, oh yeah, you're higher up in your racial identity development. Whereas people who had maybe never talked about oppression before, maybe they knew what it was in their body, and I wasn't asking them questions about their body. I was asking them to use their words. So that was one limitation. So people who seemed to look like they were lower on their development maybe weren't. Maybe they were just speaking in a different language, and I wasn't talking in that language. People may have been in the encounter stage, so like I said, those qualifiers of telling their story, like maybe this. Maybe if I would have talked to them like 3 months later, They would have thought very differently about what happened. So that's something to remember. Freedom to practice anti-oppressively. JL wasn't allowed to use culturally sensitive interventions in her site, and she had to resort to school and only talk about it at school. So just not having those experiences to engage in like cultural humility in her approaches led to less stories about it. Especially if you went to a school that didn't even talk about it at all. So maybe they had the ability to use those approaches and they had the skills, but they weren't in a system or a place that would allow it. And then finally, Latino racial identity development. I had to pick one model. I wasn't able, this is one study. I couldn't go too crazy and use a lot of different models. So it just so happened that the Mexican-American participants in my study didn't seem to pass the encounter stage, or maybe they were just focusing on race representation when they got up a little bit higher. And if I had used a Latino racial identity development model, I just wonder what it would have looked like. And I wonder how my Black clients would have, or my Black participants would have looked with a Latino racial identity development model. So if I would do this again, and I had more time, I probably would use multiple models, or I would show them to my participants, and I would say, hey, what does it look like is happening right now with you? And maybe what's more appropriate. But I had to, I had to group everybody. So that's one of the flaws of using one model. Not everyone's the same. So that was one big thing that came up. And finally, future directions and something to think about. The change-making potential of this type of research. I had several participants say, oh, I've never thought about this before. Yeah, let me think about this. It was so cool to hear that, because I could tell, this was the seed that was being planted just by doing this research, just by participating in the study. And I'm so curious, where they are now. Yonsei was able to articulate her social justice mission at the end of her interview, whereas at the beginning of her interview, she was one of those people that said, I don't even think I'm oppressed, she said. So being able to see just how having these kind of conversations during the study was affecting them. And I just wonder what it would be like if more research looked like this. In race oppressive power dynamics, one of those themes. So JL wasn't the only one that brought up having a consensual relationship with her Black supervisor. It actually came up. And I think there's just certain skills that come with that, how much to disclose, how to see what is right now, or one of the stories we're pointing to. And then finally, the impact, I haven't really talked about this, but the impact of my personal voice on the current research. Especially when it came that has to do with I was not a researcher during those conversations with my participants. That was me. I was completely me. And and I think that's one of the anti-oppressive stances that I am taking. I wanted to own it. I am a student, I am a minority, and I'm doing this research, and I wasn't going to act like I wasn't. And so I was like that with participants. The last thing I wanted to say was when Yonsei said, I was just avoiding Black clients, I was scared. And I said, like a protective thing? And she said, I don't know if protective is the right word, but yeah, maybe protecting my image. And after the interview, and I was listening to it to transcribe it, I was like, why did I say protective? Where did that word come from? And that was me. That was me saying that. That was something I would have done to protect myself. Something I continue to do. I haven't worked with Hispanic clients since like a really hard experience. I'm protecting myself. I'm protecting my reputation in this field right now by not doing that. And that was totally my personal voice coming out in a way I did not intend or plan, you know, but I hope that the dialogue that came out of it, it really had both of us thinking. And I just thought that was a beautiful contamination of data. So that's it. And these are some pictures of people who couldn't be here today. So I don't know how much I went over.
That's okay. I appreciate that there was a lot that you had tonight, and that you were able to, you know, provide us what you could in the short amount of time that you had. So I'm going to now ask Dr. Lang if she has any questions for you.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, your voice, your questions, and your critical and contaminated and approach to that question. Interrogation. I actually had a question. The biggest question I had in meeting your people was about your personal voice, and I really appreciate how you ended your talk just now, because I'm curious from a qualitative perspective about your voice throughout. And we talk about this being about these 11 people's counter stories, but really it's 12 people's counter stories, and then maybe just one person's counter story. And there are pros and cons to that, of course. Could you talk a little bit about how you balance your personal voice, being the voice that ultimately is what we're hearing, balance with the fact that these 11 people trusted you to tell their story, and how you sifted through the qualitative process?
I cried a lot. I realized if I didn't cry, and if I was going to just analyze my data, it wasn't going to be what I wanted it to be, and it was going to be what many other people would have wanted it to be. And so I mean that by, I feel like I would have taken the heart out of it, and I just feel like that was exactly what I was trying to fight. So I had to really take ownership and feel proud that I was crying. And I had to be proud of the fact that I was walking in that gray borderline the whole time, whether I liked it or not. And I think that's kind of what I really want to get at. We're in it right now, whether we like it or not. And I could have pretended. I could have just stayed on the professional world. And I could have pretended that I wasn't getting affected. And I could have turned off. I know how to do that. And I could have maybe not brought in the borderland metaphor at all. And just talked about the themes, you know. And there was just this moment as a researcher and as a person where, like, owning it was I'm not the same person I was when I started the study. And I think I had to be really proud of that. And I had to use that pride to do it anyway. You know, I had to remember that you were my reader. And I had to remember that you were my chair. And I wasn't going to get in trouble. I wasn't going to get, you know, called not a psychologist. And then I started running out of time. I think I sat with it for about a month of how to do this and how to present the stories. And finally I was like, okay, you're going to Alaska. Like, you have to get it together. And I did it in the only way I knew how. And I just did it without filtering myself and just doing what felt right. And I know that doesn't sound like a very reliable, replicable method. So I tried my best to cite the authors of who suggested the structure of my analysis. But when I finally let myself just tell my story with their words, all of a sudden it was like 120 pages. And it was great. Like, it was the best writing I ever had. I usually struggle with grammar, and I struggle with using the right words. My Spanish becomes a problem. And all of a sudden, like, my Spanish was a strength, and my culture was a strength. And I felt like I didn't have any sense of insecurity throughout my entire analysis. And it wasn't because I had a master's in research. You know, I thought I was going to be able to, like, fall back on that and trust myself on that. I started falling back on the fact that I was just being me. And I brought, like, my whole self to this. And so, like, if someone had to ask me, how do I do this? I'm doing something really similar. I would point them to those authors about the counter stories. And Attride Sterling does a great, like, 6-step model of creating themes, and I am all for that because we do need some kind of reliability in qualitative research. But when it comes to tying all the narratives together, I think that we really need to listen to our own wisdom, and we need to respect it because that wisdom is what has survived. So I don't know if that answers the question, but.
So speaking of transparency, I was struck by the different lenses that you brought in, and so sort of the circular and flattening pieces, but then there were these other hierarchical pieces that seemed juxtaposed to the more circular, so the hierarchical global theme, the hierarchy of even the identity models, you know, and so how do you make sense of that, this hierarchy and the powered nature? You even talk about empowering and like that trading of power, what does that mean? So that powered strand juxtaposed with this circular way of thinking about power that Anzaldúa and Freire really bring in. How do you wrap those together? Because I feel them clashing quite a bit.
Oh, yeah.
And even that line is another clash in that very same thing, represented physically and metaphorically. Can you talk about that? And I don't know.
That was my first, that was my first hurdle.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, that was my first stunning. Like, I felt paralyzed the moment I started saying words like hierarchy and development. And Attride Sterling actually does not use hierarchical themes. So I had to, I looked to authors who did it anyway. So that was my first goal. I just wanted to see if it's been done before. So it has, and so that kind of secured me a little bit. But then I tried really hard to get my chair to help me with that dilemma. It did not work out. But he talked me through it. And like, when I say it did not work out, he did not give me the straight answer that I wanted. He's really good at not doing that. But we talked about it, and I had to finally, there's two answers to it. So I really side with the status-oriented models. I know that there's still debate about it. So not talking about stages and talking about growth as a status, and we could go from one place to another. We could be internalizing our racial identity, but kind of be behind in our gender identity and knowing our privilege about our gender identity, for example. So that's like one example of status. So I use the word status throughout the paper. I don't think that answers it, though. So finally, I had to really get down to what I feel about development. And for those of you who don't know, I focus on children and parents. And so I have my own views on development. And if I had to sum it up, I would say I really believe in development as a concept of learning tasks. Life is about learning. And learning when we're ready. I think as parents or teachers or healers, we really want our clients or our kids or our students to just know this already, and we wish we could just deposit it in their brain and they would know it. They may know it for a test, but that's not how development works. And I think that being comfortable with if someone has to know about oppression, maybe they're not ready yet. And it doesn't matter how much I tell them about it, how much I define it for them. It's like something's closed right here. And I could be yelling, I could be using words that are 5th grade level, and their development is just not there yet. I say that non-judgmentally because they're probably in a place that I want to be too. I think it's really hard when we see our kids grow up because we know that they're never going to be there again, you know? So I should go back and focus more on not seeing development as this is better. It's just different. And the things that we're able to do up here are just different. And the things that we're able to do over here are different. But when it comes to progress, and when it comes to actually having the competence to use our voice to engage in action and social justice, there is development. And to say that there isn't, to say that we're all at the same field and the same plane, it really devalues just how much empowerment is needed to be able to have that voice or to be able to fight for something. And I have to stand by that, you know, because it is a stance when it comes to this developmental psychology field. And I think those same race oppressive dynamics, one of my favorite quotes from JL is she's talking about her black supervisor saying to her white friends, her black supervisor told JL, I tell my white friends that they're blacker than me. And JL goes, I don't want to say she was earlier, but that was earlier. And it's like, you can't argue with that. It's true. If that woman is not able to acknowledge her blackness, how is she going to be able to be in a developmental place to show JL or accompany JL through this journey of acknowledging her blackness? So I had to stand by that.
Good?
I mean, I have a lot more questions, but I want to make sure.
I have a lot more answers. I love your questions.
I know you do.
I mean, along the lines of what you were saying, though, I think the application of hierarchy to development is a problem. It's a hierarchy. That's what Wilbur said. It's a nesting. It's a nesting process with one thing we stand on the shoulders, first of all, of those who came before. Right? And progress is being able to look a little further. But that's progress. You know, and it's not better or worse. It's what is the good, the true, the beautiful, and that we aspire for those things. And that the closer we are to them as professionals, that's what we're committed to. That's what it's all about. It's that can we take you a little further. It's not to put you down, it's to lift you up. It's to lift you up. And so, yeah, to not know what oppression is when you're being oppressed is a problem.
It's early.
It's early.
It's early. It's destructive. It's destructive. And we can't turn a blind eye to that and say, but it's not a better or worse thing, right? And, you know, as you talked about, like, you know, this is what had to be for me to do this dissertation. You describe what Ferry said is education. That's it. It's a do trait. It's to draw out. It's but you have to believe that that potential is there, that it's always there to be drawn out of. And you have to trust in the process. You have to trust that it's painful, and difficult, and challenging.
And personal.
And always personal.
Oh.
Always. And the personal is always political. That's the other. So it's, a question that always in my mind is, what is the meaning of talking about diversity and never hear the word justice or oppression? How could that be? But that's the gap.
Or the border.
Because it's harder to talk about justice. It's harder to talk about it. Those are personal.
And we don't always have to talk about it. Sometimes we need to cry about it.
So I think that it's important that you sort of exemplify. And you said, well, this is how my dissertation got written, because it was always in you. And when the student was ready, then the teacher. So it's a dialogue. So it's never banking.
It's making space for it.
Right. And being co-intentional and co-investigative. And so we're having a dialogue. This is exemplifying. We're a dialogue. We're not talking at people. We're talking with each other. And saying, well, what's your story? And what's your experience? So thank you for that. I'll open this up.
You don't need to be any kind of educated to have questions, so any questions are welcome.
I just want to say you did a beautiful job, Cynthia. Really complex piece of work.
Yeah, I don't remember the past 40 minutes.
More than 40 minutes. But it's so hard and soul that you put into this work, and you had the best committee I can imagine to shepherd you through this. It's just really beautiful and
You mentioned something about the bubble as possibly empowering, which I think is an important thing in terms of like the national conversation. It's about how the collegiate bubble fails to prepare people to thrive in the outside world. But you stated that safe learning environments could empower students who are oppressed, students that experience oppression, to better thrive in the outside world. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. I'm going to ask, just turn in this with teary eyes right now. I have a bunch of books on the desk. It's just going to help with that.
Okay.
I forgot to bring them. They say it has a post-it that says Cynthia Bugs for Defense. So the bubble was it was one of my favorite themes, because it's gonna be hard not to talk about this hierarchy. So I felt like at the earlier stage or level, it was just a matter of being welcome into school and feeling like you could walk in and people believed in you. Which I think is huge. I don't want to even minimize that a bit, especially with the history of segregation in this country. And the academic achievement gap is a felt experience. We see numbers all the time when we talk about the gap, and it's something that you experience as a student. And you don't go get a higher education degree and you're like, okay, I don't know. Like it's internalized. My first negative school experience was when I was in pre-K, and my grandpa was trespassing, I guess, and going into the school and peeking into the windows and watching my white teacher keep me in detention for not getting my math problems right, and I wasn't allowed to go outside. I don't remember it, but that's why my grandpa ended up yelling at her and ripping me out of school. And it's just amazing. I don't remember it, but I'm really good at not knowing math. And so that's something I really want to say, like when it comes to this bubble. When that bubble is created, I think it's just a success for educators, for peers, for school administrators. If we can somehow create this bubble, I think it needs to happen. The world outside is not safe. And school is not going to be safe at the end of the day. But maybe we can be brave in school. And so the bubble is a success story. And the fact that all of these students, even though they had personal experiences of oppression in schools, felt that bubble anyway. So that was really big for me. And then I think the liberative, another part of it was, what was the third theme? I'm so bad about that. I'm going to go back because I want to get it right. So diversity affirmations. It's one way of maybe starting that bubble making, but we have to practice what we preach. So someone talked about just feeling the bubble because she saw the affirmations on the wall when she walked in. And she was like, I'm here. You know, and it was so big for her. It didn't matter that justice wasn't on the mission. It was just so big for her to see like cultural sensitivity or like diversity as a value. We all know what Spencer thinks about diversity, right? It's not always a good word for people. And so just the fact that she could walk in and walking into an institution that valued that, I could start the bubble. And then the liberative part was being able to have dialogue. Freire says dialogue is the foundation. Dialogue is love. And I think through dialogue, we feel healed, we feel empowered, and we feel like we can do it again. So that's the liberation part, I think. So people were telling these stories with tears, talking about their professors, talking about being called out by professors on the first day of class, talking about professors holding them during disciplinary action. And these weren't just like, oh, you know, things were awful, my professor felt so bad for me. It was like a professor holding someone and literally lifting them back up and guiding them throughout that. I got to experience that. And I feel like even though I've had horrible education experiences, one liberation experience could be so transformative, and it could change your whole view of education, and it could change just what you think is possible in the classroom. I had some strong views about education that were not good, and I kind of had lost hope in it. And I've had beautiful relationships with my professors, and I don't think that I would want to be a teacher if it wasn't for them. I don't think I would ever want to be back in a school. So yeah, I think that the bubble pop is really sad. It's just the fact that it exists, I think, is just amazing. So I want to pass. I don't know if I answered everything, but
It did.
I'm going to pass these around while I'm talking.
I do also want to go ahead and say that, like the commentator in the back said, that this was an absolutely amazing presentation, and I think that personally it makes me feel more affirmed in my decision to pursue education and also in my decision to stay in the field and be that kind of person that other people need. So thank you so much.
Thanks for saying that. I am passing out what I've been reading for the past 3 years. I'm also, since I didn't get to talk about my personal voice very much, I grew up on this book. They're pictures. It's called In My Family. It's by Carmen Lomas Garza, no relation. And it's about the culture in South Texas. And it's just great to look at pictures when people are being serious. So feel free to look at pictures. I'm going to start at the back.
Cynthia, the final question that I have for you, and I asked everyone this, tell me about your own experience with this, and what surprised you most in this process? And then what hidden expectations that it revealed for you?
Yeah. Slide about that. Yeah. Say the last bit.
And what hidden expectation does that surprise reveal for you?
I'm going to skip to the slide real quick. There we go. I'll tell one story. Jessica was serving a primarily Latino population as an Asian American woman. And she showed cultural humility by going to a conference. She went and she was like, I want to learn everything I possibly could about this population and what kind of approaches work well with them. I did a lot of research. I got into actual research. Went to a conference because I knew I wanted to learn more about the Latino population. Like, I knew nothing about this population, so I was committed. Nobody paid me for doing this research. I think that was a good attitude to go into that work, that environment. I know culture and rapport building go hand in hand, so I did soften my demeanor. I'm a person who has real clear boundaries between my personal life and my professional life. But because I knew trust, respect, warmth, and celebration are so important to the Latino community, I have to get down to their level. It's a different world. I want to reframe that. If I don't see their culture, then they don't exist for me. So I did lots of preparation. So there's a bunch of this that we could talk about. But what I learned, when she reframed, she said, get down. So there's power. She was conscious that she was doing that. So she reframed it immediately. And I think we had to get really good at saying that sentence. I want to reframe that. And she said this, if I don't see their culture, then they don't exist for me. And I did not know what that meant. And I looked at her story as a metaphor. So like the environment, softening her demeanor. She doesn't have to walk in with a guard, with armor. She's willing to cross the boundary between personal and professional. She even says it. So that I understood everything she was talking about until the moment she said, I don't see them. And so I brought in my wall metaphor. I didn't really talk about this, but in this country, we talk about building walls. And we don't realize that walls kill borders. They kill the borderlands. And we're not going to just build a wall in the bottom, in our south part of our country. We're going to kill all the culture that exists because there aren't walls. And so when she talks about going hand in hand, and she talks about crossing that, and then seeing them, I was like, oh, there was a wall. And she didn't see the other side. And I needed that metaphor to understand it. So I say, walls in my experience are both a symbol of survival and division. It was a lesson for me to hear Jessica's experience of extinction rather than simply division. As she dismantles a wall and learns of the existence of the different world on the other side, Jessica crosses over and drops her Western language power. I learned a lot from her, and we dialogued a lot. And she is trilingual. So a lot of her stories were filled with different metaphors. But learning how a wall is not just a matter of dividing, but it's a way of just not seeing people, and acknowledging what invisible walls we have within us that we're putting in front of certain people. I know it's so physical and obvious, like obviously there's a wall there, you know, but I never experienced walls that way because I know who's over there. You know, family's over there. So I don't need a wall to tell me what's over there or what's not. But maybe if a wall is built, I'll forget. I won't forget they exist though, because they're my family. But a lot of people will forget they even exist. And yeah, I think that's just something I learned. I never really thought about that, and it was just really touching for me because that was what I was like guiding all my research, and then it just like came up so obviously. So that was like something that really surprised me. I felt like as a researcher, I was like bringing in this metaphor, right, and like turning my data into something. But when she said that, when she said it that way and talking about her clear boundaries and talking about the way it leads to extinction or lack of existence, I learned from that story. And so I think that answers it. It was something that I didn't even anticipate. And it was something personally that I was able to start seeing why this talk of walls was a personal threat to my existence and the people in my family. Keep raising it and putting it down.
Well, I wanted to thank the faculty for letting outsiders like us come, because this is fascinating and important. I'm a civil rights lawyer, so I deal with social psychologists a fair amount and critical race theory, but which I knew was multidisciplinary, but this is opening a whole new window, and I broke down a bunch of things I want to research and try and use in my world to explain things to judges and employers and talk about things like intent. But I was wondering, it's kind of fascinating and follow up on, I think one of the thank you for this. It seems as if you grew a lot as a person and maybe healed a little bit yourself throughout working on this dissertation. Did you, from your research methodology, which is counter to what we all think is objective, even though I don't believe there is such a thing, but did you learn something from that process, or do you think you can replicate something from that process? Is that a kind of a method that you're going to use in your own practice, or, you know, I think it seems like some of this dialoguing and things that you're doing via an interplay between your research method and the way that you want to practice, or it's just...
Yeah. Crying used to be a big thing for me. I noticed I've been emphasizing it a lot. Tyler didn't meet me before I was a crier. Or before I was not a crier. I used to be really stoic. And I used to be really good at not showing my emotions. And when I had this awful education experience, I experienced not having that control anymore. And it just like flooded me, and it was very traumatizing for me. Because that's a survival skill, not showing your emotions. And having that survival skill taken out of me so publicly, it was really hard, and I think that was the beginning of a lot of this research for many different ways. But that was one of them personally. I started to realize that something was going to come out of me, whether I liked it or not, and it wasn't going to be pretty, and it was going to be filled with snot. And it was going to happen, so I might as well do it under this bubble and find my people, you know. And I started to feel all the pain that I hadn't felt. I was a lot like Fatih and Mona and Sabina, where I didn't talk about oppression before this. I was really good at being argumentative in class, I think. But I didn't really, what I was argumentative about, I don't think it was necessarily about oppression. And so hearing all these stories, every time I heard them, it was healing a little bit, because it was so validating. I didn't have to tell my story to them, and they were telling me mine, you know, over and over. each participant had more than 5 stories. You know, they would tell a story and then remember and say, oh, can I talk about this? And of course. And it was just, I couldn't not heal, you know? And it was happening during my interviews. Someone would be saying something, and they would be saying exactly what I went through, and I didn't even talk to anyone about it. And I started to realize that I don't care if people aren't going to approve that method, because it was something that was going to keep me alive, and it was something that was going to make this profession worth it for me. And if I was going to bow my head down and do it in a way that was objective and immediate path, I wouldn't be healing. And I would, if anything, start sacrificing even more parts of myself. So when I said earlier I'm not the same person, I started to just realize that not only was it going to happen anyway, but especially if I delve into this field, it was going to happen in a way that was not going to be graceful. And it was going to happen in a way that it, you know, as a 5-foot-tall, petite woman, I was going to have a lot of bravery, and I was going to have like the stance of this. I like to picture like my spirit animal is just this huge gorilla, and I had to feel like that if I was going to do this. Not to do it, not to talk to my participants, but to be able to get out of the bubble and to take this with me. The last bit of the Brave Space Pledge that I passed around on my card is being able to take our brave spaces with us, embodying the space so that we can use our power as psychologists or as people, whatever field you're in, to make space. And that takes so much bravery when you're not in the bubble. So yeah, I knew I wasn't going to need to be a gorilla here today, or in my dissertation I talk about it being a lion. But I knew that I'm working up to it right now. And
feedback from any of the people you interviewed that it was healing or transformative for them, just being part of the study?
I interviewed a lot of them in school spaces or in training spaces, and several of them said, oh my gosh, I've never cried in school before. So I don't think they outwardly said like, oh, this is healing, but just being able to be that whole self, even though it was a closed classroom space, that was big, I think. A lot of, I would stop recording like right after they were done. And I got so mad because every time I would stop recording, the best parts would come out. And so like, and I couldn't be like, wait, stop saying these amazing things. And like, I couldn't do that. So by the end of it, I stopped pushing stop. But for at least more than half, no, way more than half. Like I would say maybe just 2 people didn't say it. Everybody else said thank you. And the people who didn't say it were crying a lot. So I think they maybe didn't say it because they were holding a lot. Or they didn't need to say it. But that was just like, I didn't expect that. I didn't expect like someone would tell a researcher thank you, you know? So they weren't telling a researcher maybe, or maybe they were telling many people. But that was nice. I didn't like write up my proposal and do all this method and say, oh, these participants are going to be so grateful. Like, that wasn't something I had planned, and everyone looked at me in the eyes and said thank you. And so that was just great, hearing that.
Well, I, for one, am grateful. And I say thank you.
And I'm very grateful that we did have people here today. I wish we'd always do it more often. And really speaks to the wall idea. I wanted to sort of highlight one thing before we stop. And that is, you know, we heard that how much education you have predicts how long you live. how much money you have predicts how long you live. And this is hard data. And so when people say we're talking about educational policy didn't help policy. They say, well, we're talking about economic policy. Economic policy is healthcare policy. And we have to break the walls down. We have to, across all of our disciplines, we have to stop thinking. Well, we're just talking about education now. We're just talking about economics now. Because you can't. Once we break those walls down, then we'll make true progress. And you're going to help. So I'm going to ask everybody to leave. And I'm going to ask you to adjourn for a moment.